Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this fifth instalment of the Dalton Expert Insight series to celebrate 20 years of Dalton. The Dalton community has the Dalton Champions, who are volunteers from the nuclear community at Manchester that organise events like this one. And today we have Mark Bassett speaking to us about the global scene of nuclear, with particular focus on the IAEA and the formation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Mark is an internationally recognised expert in the nuclear field with over 40 years of experience. This began with 20 years at the Office for Nuclear Regulation, ONR, where he worked extensively on numerous international nuclear issues, becoming Deputy Chief Inspector during his time there. Later on, Mark spent 5 of his 8 years as Special Assistant to the Director General of Nuclear Safety, Security and Safeguards at the IAEA. And during this time, he had roles advising on various international political scenarios, such as Ukraine and Iran. So I don't think there's many people, if any, that are more qualified to speak on this topic than Mark, so very glad to have him. Maybe Mark, really double pass over.
Okay, thank you, Fran. Everything working okay? Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to do this talk. When I was first asked to do this, thought, gosh, this is a big topic to try to squeeze into one 45-minute talk. So I agreed that we would split this into two. And the first one that we will do will be a more global overview. I'll go through a little bit of the history. Let's put the scope up. Here we go. Is it? Here we go. Right. So we'll talk about the the overall system of the global nuclear system that's we developed over since the 40s. And then the second one that I'll do in 2 weeks' time will dive into a little bit more of the detail. We'll have quite a bit of detail today, but I'll dive into a little bit more of the detail. And to a certain extent, I'll ask you at the end of this what you'd want me to concentrate on, because there's lots to talk about. But what we'll talk about today is the creation, the development of the agency, the NPT, and the wider nuclear system. Now, there's lots of different international organizations, whether they are scientific bodies like some of the UN bodies on radiation protection. There's the World Association of Nuclear Operators. There's a Nuclear Energy Agency. There's a load of them around. But I think to get a sense of how the global nuclear system actually works, concentrating today on the IAEA and the NPT, I think they are the key organizations and ideas that I think illustrate where we are. So I'll talk about the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'll talk about the IAEA, and then we'll split it up into the sort of things that the IAEA does. And then we'll do a summary, and then I'll talk about the scope of the next talk that we'll do. First thing before we go on to the slides is why would you want to know about any of this stuff? Because I have to say, when I was doing in my time in the industry, both in the private sector and then the regulator, and then moving into international work, to be perfectly honest, I didn't know a lot of this stuff. I worked on things in the UK predominantly, and even though I had a feeling of how this worked internationally, I didn't really understand it. And it was only perhaps over the last 10 years that I've really got to understand it. And it didn't do me any harm not really understanding all of this. But I would say having an understanding now is more important than ever, because of some of the key things that are happening in the global sector of nuclear. You know, for example, we're talking now about small modular reactors being built in Africa. You know, how does that work? How does the whole system fit together? How is that enabled? And I think it's more important than ever for people to at least have an understanding of some of that. So what I'm going to do first of all is talk about the history of where we got to. So 1945, We all know that there were the bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, seen the film Oppenheimer, I guess. Even at that early stage, it was recognized that nuclear was sort of Janus-faced. It had the capability of massive destruction, but it also had the capability of, for good, for nuclear energy and other purposes. But anyway, of course, for the world, it was quite a shock that Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. To the United States in 1945. Then, 1949, the Soviet Union had a test. That was even more probably of a shock, certainly in the West. How on earth did they get that technology? We now know Klaus Fuchs and various other people, and the Manhattan Project to pass that on. And then the UK did in 1952. And there was an understanding that even though those three countries had already going down the nuclear road, others were wanting to do it too. And there was a real fear that there would be a massive proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. And what was also happening, and I was talking about that sort of two-sided thing of nuclear. The UK, for example, were already decided to have a program of nuclear energy. Okay, and this is a picture here of Calder Hall being built on the Sellafield site. But this was two purposes. And it was both to generate electricity, but also to produce plutonium for the bomb. And that was where the investment really came. And the fact that from making a decision, the Labour government making the decision in the late 40s to that up and running in 1956, incredibly quick. But, oops, right. So this is the context. So countries were building nuclear power stations. 3 countries had already got the bombs. And there was a concern of proliferation. So in 1953, there was the famous Atoms for Peace speech by Eisenhower, President Eisenhower. Now, this was a really, really important speech. And interestingly, this was almost all written by President Eisenhower himself. We did a commemoration of this, of the history of a couple of years ago on in the agency. And you can see his scribbles. You can see on his notes, he'd annotated them and he'd been writing on them as he was landing into New York on a plane. This was very much his drive. And so it's 1953, and he gave this speech called the Atoms for Peace speech. Now, if you've not read it, find it online. It's really, really interesting. Because what it does is it's very radical and very far-reaching if you read it. So he talked about the concerns about proliferation, but at the same time, the great benefits that could be had from nuclear energy. And he already, at that stage, he wasn't just talking about power, he was talking about medicine, he was talking about agriculture and everything like that. But he said it was very clear that there was the concerns about proliferation. So what he did is he proposed the setting up of what he called an International Atomic Energy Agency. Even at that stage, which would be under the aegis of the United Nations. But actually, it was far more radical than just that. He actually proposed that nuclear material would be added to a pool, which would then be managed by this agency and provide that nuclear material around the world. Now, in actual fact, that bit never happened, though you can still see bits of it, of where it is in the statute of the agency, which I'll talk about later. But the idea of having an agency took hold. And it was only like 3 years before the agency was set up. And 81 countries signed up to it in 1956, and the agency was set up in 1957. But before talking about the agency, I want to fast forward to 1970. Oh, sorry, you're pressing the wrong one. Right. I'm going to go forward to 1970, because by that stage, they already got the United States, Soviet Union, and the UK got the bomb. The French got one in 1960, and the Chinese in 1964. And as I said, there was the concern of more and more potential proliferation. And what actually happened there was both the United States and the Soviet Union understood something had to be done. It was really interesting. You're in the middle of the Cold War, but they were both concerned about proliferation. And so what happened after a lot of negotiations and bringing countries along with them was in 1970 there was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, this is absolutely key treaty, and it's not often properly, I don't think, always properly understood by people in the nuclear community how important this treaty was and still is. So in 1970, it was near universal adoption from countries around the world signed this treaty. There were some notable exceptions, and I'll talk about those a little later. For example, India, Pakistan, and Israel didn't sign and still have not signed. I'll talk about that a little later. But what did it do? Well, the most interesting thing it did was set up the legal distinction between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, the P5. Now, those 5 who had, as I had the slide earlier, did nuclear tests and got the bomb. It's no coincidence that they are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Were then and still are now. Okay, the Soviet Union turned to Russia, Russian Federation, but basically so 5. So how on earth was this deal done? Now, this is what people call the grand bargain. It's the big, effective global nuclear deal that still exists. And it has 3 components to it. So let's look at these 3. States without, now these are my words, they're not the exact words in the treaty, but states without nuclear weapons promise not to develop or acquire them and then submit themselves to IAEA inspections to verify their adherence. That's a big give that those countries did. Huge. First of all, they say we're not going to develop weapons. Think of all the countries around the world that may want to do that. And they opened themselves up to international inspections. That's a huge thing for a sovereign state to do. So how were they persuaded to do that? Well, the second part is the states with nuclear weapons promised in good faith to limit the nuclear arsenals. Now, we actually know that that's not actually ended up in practice, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But the third thing, which was really important, was those with the means to harness the peaceful uses of nuclear technology pledge to make them available for those that don't. That's the key bit. That's why you can have nuclear power stations around the world. That's why, when you're talking about SMRs, you can have SMR in a country that's never had nuclear technology before. Why? Because through this treaty, those countries who possess technology commit to provide that technology to others. But with a deal is, we'll do that, but you won't get nuclear weapons yourself, will you? Or try to get them. And you'll open yourself up to inspection. Absolutely massive, that. And actually led to the development of nuclear power around the world. But I would just say that it's coming under increasing challenge. Every 5 years, there's a review, the NPT. First of all, it's unlimited. It's got no time limits, which is good. But the last couple of review meetings, they've not come to agreement on certain things under that treaty. And this is part of the situation we're in now. And I'll talk about this a little later. But we're increasingly fractious world. The so-called rules-based order is coming under challenge. Big issues like Ukraine have changed the discussion. But still, I would contend, and I think most people contend, that they want to keep the treaty. It's very, very important. Now, there is another treaty on the abolition of nuclear weapons, which those countries which said on this second one, the nuclear countries have not done their side of the bargain. So they've developed and have, it's now in force, another convention or a treaty on the abolition of nuclear weapons, but it's not got universal adoption. Of course, the P5 have not signed it, and neither have those countries that feel that they're under the umbrella of the support from certain of the P5 countries. But it tells you something about where the NPT and the challenge it's coming under. Okay, so next. I wanted to talk about the NPT before we got to the agency, because you'll see how then all of this fits together with how the NPT is implemented in practice. So let's talk about the IAEA. It sees itself as the global focal point for nuclear cooperation around the world, based mainly in Vienna, Austria. Interesting, it's also got laboratories, and these are very important. There are not many, if at all, any multinational, multilateral laboratories on nuclear technology, certainly not within the UN system. There's some other offices in New York, Geneva, Toronto, Tokyo, 179 member states. I'll talk about why there's so many in a minute. 2,500 staff. And what's also important, it has its own statute, governing bodies, budget and secretariat. And I'll talk about why that's important in a minute. So what does the IAEA do? Well, I've broken it down into sort of three. It does other things, but these three are key. So number one, assisting member states in the peaceful use of nuclear technology, including power generation and the transfer of technology and knowledge to developing member states. Now you can see now that is the implementation of that strand, or that pillar of the NPT. Of course, other countries do that into bilateral arrangements, but this is the multilateral arrangement. Second, verifying through inspection that states comply with their commitments under the NPT and other agreements to use nuclear material and facilities only for peaceful purposes. So this is the bit of the agency which is like the active arm of the NPT in ensuring that there is no proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. And thirdly, developing nuclear safety standards, and based on those promoting high levels of nuclear safety and protection of the environment, and have health and the environment against ionizing radiation. So that effectively is the part of the deal in reality of the NPT, which is we're going to help you have this technology, but we can't insist on certain things, and I'll talk about that in a minute about nuclear safety, but we're going to develop nuclear safety standards which will assist you and help you to make sure that what we're providing to you is going to be safe and safe. You will notice there's nothing in here about disarmament. The agency has nothing to do with that pillar on disarmament. That's elsewhere. But those other two pillars are key to the work of the agency. So let's briefly talk about IAEA and global politics. So when it was set up, it has a relationship with the UN, but it's called a part of what's called the UN family. So within the UN family, there are those that are UN bodies within the structures, and there are those that are part of what's called the broader family, and the agency is one of those. Why is that important? Well, what it does is it helps to separate the agency from some wider UN political and organizational structures. And it emphasizing that the IAEA is technical and not political. Really important. But that is not to say that politics doesn't have an impact. It very much does. And increasingly it does in the board and elsewhere. But what there is this thing that's called the Vienna spirit, which is that in Vienna, there was the idea that you reach things through consensus. So when you're developing all of these things like safety standards and the like, or whether it's the resolutions that are done, the countries, up to very recently anyway, have always really tried to reach a consensus position. Keep it technical, try as much as you can to keep the politics out of it, but of course politics does intervene, and there's various false trading that will go on between various other countries. But that's been very, very important to the success of an organization like the IAEA. But that's coming under challenge. When I joined the agency, it was still almost unheard of. It happened occasionally that things in the board and the general conference, these are the policy-making organs of the agency, they would try to reach consensus on various resolutions. And very rarely, if ever, did it go to a vote. They now go to votes much more often, because what's actually happening is that there's that challenge, as we say, to the rules-based order. Issues, particularly about Ukraine, has had a huge impact on nuclear safety issues and nuclear security issues in the board, where different countries now are finding very, very difficult to agree text. So it's having an impact. What I would say, though, is, and I'll talk about this at the summary at the end, the Vienna spirit still lives, but it tends to live still in the working. So the nuclear safety standards bodies or other bodies or whatever still very much try to work that way. But there is this political noise that is around, but I think the agency is still, as a technical organisation, still highly valued by member states. So I'll come back to that a little later. So what the agency do? So the bit that I'll talk about briefly is what's called the peaceful uses part of the agency's mandate. And I'll split it into two, talk about this briefly. First is nuclear energy, not the safety bit, but nuclear energy though. Now, I talked a bit earlier, I mentioned about how Calder Hall was done incredibly quickly. Talking to Fran earlier about wind-scale piles that went up very, very fast on Sellafield site. But we all know that nuclear is so slow, it takes forever to get anything done and built and whatever. But it can be done quickly and safely And an example I will use is the UAE, where they made a decision in 2008 to have nuclear power in the UAE. They had nothing. They had no governmental structures, they had no legal structures, they had no regulatory body, they had no industry, they had little skills, knowledge, experience of nuclear. 2008. But they made a decision that they wanted nuclear power. This is Baraka Power Station, 2024. They've got 4 1,400 megawatt reactors up and running. From 2008 to 2024. That's pretty damn quick. How did they do that? Well, they did it, of course, political will. They had the money. And a country like UAE may be able to do things that some other countries may find difficult to do in their own country. But also, they had the agency to help them out. They came to the agency and said, what do we need to do? And the agency has what's called the milestones approach, which is already set up, which is how do you start from scratch and set up a nuclear power program? And it's all in there. What you need to do with government, legal, regulation, industry, safety culture, skills, knowledge and experience, supply chain, all of that. It's all there. And it was vital. The agency, I don't think, and I think they'd admit it, the UAE would have been able to do this without the agency. So this is also now about, if you're thinking about small modular reactors in an African state which has never had one before, or whatever. They look to the agency to help them out. There's all these vendors around the world who are trying to flog them reactors. They want to have somebody that is independent that will be able to advise them accordingly and not necessarily getting hocked to any one vendor. Of course, in the end, they're going to have to make a decision, and these were Korean reactors. But that's where the agency comes in into the nuclear energy part of its business. But there's the other bit which, well, my slides are not great on that, which is sort of unsung and not really recognised. Now, I said that there was 179 member states in the agency. There's only about 30 odd nuclear power that have nuclear power. Why do all these countries want to be members of the agency? Okay, to a certain extent, they're under the safeguards agreement, but that's not the real reason. The real reason is technical. The agency does the non-nuclear stuff, non-nuclear power stuff, the nuclear technologies. Radiotherapy, for example. I mean, my old boss, Rafael Mariano Grossi, the DG, would talk about how it was a scandal that half of the countries in Africa didn't have one single radiotherapy machine. It was about getting up there and assisting those countries to be able to use nuclear technology for good, for things like radiotherapy, for things like agriculture. So, for example, sterilizing mosquitoes or whatever it may be. And there's lots of other things. There's water management. There's very other things, plastics in the ocean. There's loads of things that the agency assists countries with now. And that's why they want to be members, because they get that benefit through what's called the Technical Cooperation Programme. And this is, again, feeds back to the NPT. The NPT says that those countries that have the technology will help those out that don't. It's part of the deal. And this is the deal for them, that they get this. And just a picture there. So this is where our laboratory, I say our because I'm no longer a member of the agency. But the labs, for example, they have safeguards labs, but they also, nuclear materials labs, but they also have things like QOP, labs in Cyberstorf in Austria, whether they will be using nuclear techniques for helping agriculture and the like. So safeguards. Now, this is the bit where, well, I would say maybe up to Ukraine, it's the bit where people, when they think of the agency, this is what they think about. I think about safeguards. So this is that bit of the deal in the NPT, which is that countries open themselves up to inspection. So there is what's called, so these countries sign on to, if they are signatories of the NPT, they are obliged to sign up to a safeguards agreement with the agency. And the one that is effectively compulsory within the NPT system is called the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, where a country will, a member state will, well, signatory to the NPT, doesn't necessarily need to be a member state of the agency, will declare, I'll come to the why it's that important word in a minute, declare its nuclear material and activities, and then the agency will inspect those. And it does it through three ways. So it does the verification and monitoring activities through physical inspection, so boots on the ground. Take samples, site monitoring, cameras in buildings, all that sort of stuff. It evaluates open source information. So looking, who's publishing what, whatever, you know. So if you're publishing something in the open domain here, you'll be pretty sure that someone in the agency will spot it. And satellite imagery. Now, I mean, when I saw some of the satellite imagery that is accessible to whatever, it's just astonishing what the detail you can see nowadays. And the third one is information provided by third parties. Now, this is a bit more sensitive because you may have one member state that will say to the agency, we think this other member state is doing so and so. And you could probably think of maybe speculate on some examples of that. The key thing about that is that the agency never takes anything at face value. So it'll take that information that was provided or claims that are made by whether it's a member state or whoever, but it will always verify before it brings it into any of its considerations. So it's a bit of a messy slide, but so I talked about the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. 189 countries have that signed. Now, remember I said declared. So a country declares what they do, and then the agency goes in and verifies it. But what about the stuff it doesn't declare? Now, what happened was in certain times, early 90s, there's a couple of examples, but I'll cite one, was the first Gulf War. And from that, it was identified that Iraq did have a covert nuclear weapons program. They were signatories of the NPT. They'd signed the CSA, Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, and yet they had a covert nuclear weapons program. I'm not talking about, you know, the one that was later with the Second Gulf War, but it was recognised that there was a hole in the system. It was sort of, everybody sort of knew there was a hole in the system to a certain extent, but there wasn't the political will to fill it until that and a couple of other things happened, which meant that something had to be done for the agency to be able also to look at undeclared facilities and look at the materials and activities. So what was created was a thing called the Additional Protocol. Now, the thing about that, it gives the agency much more power to go in and sort of say, it has a good reason, but it may, if it's got good reason to think, there's a facility over there, that country is not declared, we want to go in and have a look. And 140 member states have signed that additional protocol. thing about it, though, and that is, as you can see, there's a number that haven't. Because unlike the CSA, the additional protocol is not mandatory. People volunteer to do that. Though there's a big push, everybody's saying this is like the gold standard, the safeguards, to sign the additional protocol. But there are some countries that haven't signed it, the key ones. If you look sort of like in the Middle East, there are some countries there that have not signed it. And the reason why they say they have not signed it, so they will not sign it until Israel joins the NPT, for example. It's where the politics is in there. There are some others. I mentioned India, Pakistan, and Israel. They never signed the NPT, but they're all members of the agency. And they have their own specific agreements with the agency. They're not quite as comprehensive as the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, but nevertheless, they have what's called an item-specific agreement. Because India in the I've got the dates here. India, 1974, the nuclear test. India always said it didn't like the idea of having the club of the 5, and only they could have nuclear weapons at the moment, the NPT. That's why they didn't sign it. Of course, if India didn't sign it, Pakistan didn't sign it. Israel, for its own reasons, didn't sign it. So Pakistan had a test in 1998. Israel has never said it has a weapon. Always kept it ambiguous. But there's the working assumption that people have is that they do. North Korea did sign the NPT. Then in the early 2000s pulled out, and then had its first test in 2006. The DPRK, as they're called, North Korea, are the only country that has pulled out of the NPT. Those others never signed. And then the final one here I've got is a voluntary offer agreement. So the P5, in order to encourage all these other countries to sign up to stuff, have their own agreements called the voluntary offer agreement. So that where they declare certain facilities. Now the UK has that agreement with the agency and opens up, there's a couple of areas it opens up, for example, the plutonium stores in Sellafield, and the enrichment facilities at Capenhurst, Urenco, those are opened up to inspection by the agency. So, some challenges on safeguards. Now, I will go into this more into the next talk, where there's some get into these in much more detail, should you wish. I mentioned North Korea. This is a imagery of a site in North Korea. They've had a number of nuclear tests, and let's say the agency actually had inspectors until they were expelled. The agency is ready to go in if there's ever going to be a deal with North Korea. Trump 1 tried to do a deal with North Korea. We'll see what happens under Trump 2. But the agency is ready to go in if it's needed. Iran is a very big issue. Very briefly, Iran, I'm conscious of the time, I'm going to have to speed up a bit. So I won't go into all of the details here, we'll do it next time. But Iran had a deal in 2015 with a number of member states and the European Union, the UK, Soviet Union, Russian Federation, UK, France, Germany, and the EU to limit its nuclear material. Then President Trump pulled out of the deal, and now Iran has got material for a number of nuclear weapons enriched up to 60%. It's a big issue in Iran. There's also evidence to suggest that they have a nuclear program, or potentially. That Iran has always said it hasn't, but the agency found some material in certain sites, and Iran's not been forthcoming on where that material came from. Another couple of others. AUKUS, not well known, this one. Well, it's sort of, this is the deal, which is the Australian, US, UK deal for providing nuclear submarines to Australia. That has been a huge issue in the agency, because China and Russia and whatever don't like that deal, and they're claiming it breaks the NPT, because nuclear weapon states are providing nuclear, what they say is nuclear weapons level material to a non-nuclear weapon state. Huge issue. We can talk about that. And then global uncertainties. Living in a time where maybe some countries are starting to think again about whether they have nuclear weapons. When looking at some of the geopolitics around the world at the moment, and that's going to be an issue. But I will talk more about that next time. So I'm conscious of the time. We'll speak to nuclear safety. So I talked about nuclear safety. What does the agency do? Well, it establishes standards of safety through its own IAEA safety standards, which is in the mandate of the agency. That this is what it should do, as I mentioned earlier. But unlike safeguards, there's no treaty-based obligations in this area. So the standards are not legally binding. And nuclear safety is a national responsibility. But I will argue that these documents are still, even though they're not legally binding, are hugely important, very important documents. So the safety standards go all the way back to 1958. But they, again, I talked about developed by consensus, the Vienna Spirit, and this is sort of part of the suite of documents of the safety standards. They're three-tiered. So at the top level, there's the fundamentals document. Is what the users must statement. And then there's a suite of documents called requirements documents, which are shall statements, and the guides, which say should. Now, they're not legally binding. So why do they have this language, which is a very legal type language of must and shall and should? Well, what happens is a lot of countries basically pick up the standards, tear the front cover off that says IAEA, put their own country's front on and say, those are our regulations. Sort of. They don't exactly do that. But the thing about these is they're easily transferable, and many countries do that. The UK doesn't. The UK has, for example, its safety assessment principles that it uses to the regulator to assess the safety of nuclear in the UK. But, and I was involved with this when we did it a long time ago, benchmarked all of those safety assessment principles against the safety standards. So even those countries that don't adopt them directly will benchmark their things against the safety standards. But as I said, the standards are not binding on states, but they are on the agency's activities. Now, this is key. So the agency itself goes out on the invitation of countries to give advisory services, safety review missions, and the like, and uses the standards upon which to judge whatever it's looking at in that member state. And this can be, these teams of experts tend to be both IAEA and experts from member states, comparing practices, and it covers a whole range of things: regulation, operational safety, long-term operation, emergency preparedness and response, a load of them, and gives recommendations through those against the safety standards, which countries will, they invite in, and then they will treat those recommendations very, very seriously. So this is a way in which, even though these documents are not legally binding, they drive the standardization, harmonization of standards across the world. So they're not mandatory, but the thing is that these missions, particularly advisory missions, are seen as good practice. And to a certain extent, the eyebrows are raised if countries don't call the agency in to look at their systems. And one thing that is of interest is, for example, the European Union Directive on Nuclear Safety mandates its members to have a review of their regulatory system, or the IRS, every 10 years. So again, this is how this drives common standards across the world. Now, there are some legal documents in safety, the safety conventions, and they do have the status in international law, and countries will sign on to them. When you talk to the lawyers, they call it soft law, whatever that may mean, but it's still international law. And there's 4 conventions. A few of them came out of Chernobyl, which I'll talk about a little bit more next time. They cover nuclear safety, spent fuel and radioactive waste management, and a couple on emergency preparedness and response. And they oblige the parties to report on implementing their obligations. And the standards, again, serve as the reference. And interestingly, within the convention that countries sign on to, and all the main nuclear states signed on to this, the fundamentals document that I talked about in the standards is pretty much copied over into the convention. So, slight tweak in wording, but so the fundamentals effectively through the conventions are legally binding. So, just some current issues on nuclear safety. Picture of my old boss there, 2 pictures. And you can see the 2 people he's speaking to. And it's showing something about the agency's status in the world at the moment. So I talked about the moves to greater harmonization. I'll just talk about that in passing, and that may go into that a little bit more detail next time. So the safety standards, lots of things are common standards, but some people argue they don't go deeply enough. Because what actually happens is someone wants to build a plant in one country, the regulator will come in, they'll say, oh yeah, that's okay, but we want this too. And then they'll go to somewhere else and they'll say, oh, yeah, we'll take that, but we'll also have that. And it makes it very, very difficult for vendors, they will argue, to be able to have a standardized fleet of reactors around the world. And it affects the economics of nuclear. So there's quite a bit of work going on about whether there are ways in which greater harmonization of safety standards. Ukraine completely dominated my life in 2022. It was a huge issue when the Ukraine war, in particular, the takeover of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant by the Russian Federation, which raised all sorts of issues about nuclear safety and security. And the agency really stepped into this. As you can see, there are very few people around the world, to be honest, who have met both of those gentlemen during this war, that DG Grossi has. And Ukraine now, the agency has people on all of the nuclear plants in Ukraine, including Zaporizhzhia, which it managed to get on in September 2022, which is actually taken over and run now by the Russian Federation. I will talk about that a little bit more later next time, but it tells you something about the agency. We talked about safety standards and the like, but I would argue there's only the IAEA that has the technical capability, the political credibility and clout to be able to do this. No other organization would have been able to get its people. I mean, it just amazes me. When I joined the agency, I would never have thought that the agency would end up having 4 armored cars. The other one I'll just touch on is Fukushima. So we'll talk about Fukushima, Chernobyl next time. But one current issue, which is a big one, is the discharge of water from Fukushima, which has caused huge issues around that region. Again, the agency stepping in, doing an independent review of all of that. We'll talk about that next time. Okay, I'm really conscious of the time. Sorry about this. Nuclear security. Here, there's no reference to nuclear security in the IAEA statute. But the agency's played an ever-increasing role in assisting states to strengthen their legal infrastructure. And there have been various issues that have arisen over time. Nuclear materials trafficking is one. 9/11 was a huge issue of what it did in terms of security issues for nuclear plants. But nuclear security is not mentioned at all in the statute. And so people questioned what allows the IAEA to get involved in all of this stuff? Well, what's actually happened is it's over time, countries have recognized that the agency has a role. So through various resolutions in the board and in the general conference and things like that, over time, the mandate has evolved. Statute's never been changed, but security has been seen as being able to fit within the wider safety mandate. And so now legally, the opinion is clear, nuclear security is part of the mandate. There's some people occasionally, when it suits them, potentially will challenge that. So nuclear security works in the same sort of way as nuclear safety. It's got the equivalent of the safety standards in its nuclear security series. There is an international convention on the physical protection of nuclear material. They have a number of advisory review services. And initially, everyone signed on to the idea the agency gets involved in physical protection. But it's evolved into things like cybersecurity, things like that. I can talk about a bit more about that next time. It's slightly trickier when the agency gets into that area. Some countries sometimes get national security and nuclear security a bit conflated. And sometimes the money is all money that comes through what's called the Nuclear Security Fund of donors and recipients. And there's sometimes arguments between the two as to whether there'll be any sort of conditions put on any of the money that will be given to them. And some countries are still cautious, but actually the IAEA's role is very much increasing in nuclear security. I'll talk more about that next time. Sorry to rush that through. So in summary, so the system's come a long way since Eisenhower's vision. And there are some significant challenges ahead. I mean, there's some technological ones, I think they'll be okay, but such as AI, its possible impact on nuclear safety, security and safeguards. But in particular, global tensions, undermining multinational institutions and cooperations. As I said, some countries perhaps looking again, developing nuclear weapons. So there are some significant challenges. I personally think the system should be able to weather those challenges. Because of all the multinational bodies, I would argue the IAEA is perhaps one of the strongest, because it's technical, and all of the countries, even though there may be big political issues around the world, still recognize the importance of keeping it technical when it comes to nuclear safety and security in the world. All I would say is, I hope I'm right about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was really, really interesting talk. You did a really good job of trying to condense so much information into such a short period of time. I think there are a lot of different conversations that can come from this. But I'll open it up to the audience if they have any questions that they'd like to ask Mark. I can corner him later, maybe. Not from online. Are there any questions? Any questions from online?
How are you blowing everyone away? No one's
Yeah.
No one's got any questions at all.
blowing them all away. 2 and 4.
Okay.
Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Yeah.
It said about sharing nuclear technology with other states, but is that also the capability to share?
Yes.
So not just giving them a reactor, let's say giving them technology to mine their own fuel.
Yes. Now, that's an interesting one because countries that are non-nuclear weapon states will cite what they call their inalienable rights to be able to have nuclear technology, including things like enrichment, which is potentially sensitive when it comes. So a country may say, well, the NPT says we can have an enrichment plant if we want, and there's certain deals. I didn't go into it this time. There's one called the 123 agreement that the United States signs with other countries, which allows the transfer of nuclear technology, making sure as well that there's other organizations that look at dual use. There's a whole field about that, which is separate from this. There was something called the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is a really important one where the nuclear suppliers, without them, they'll look at a country's systems and decide whether it's appropriate to transfer their technology under the NPT to those countries to make sure that they want to make sure that there's dual use. Because one of the things I touched on at the beginning, effectively the technology is the same. Nuclear power and nuclear weapons in terms of things like enrichment, for example. But what some countries, and one of the things I was involved with when I first joined the agency, the LEU Bank, was try to make sure that countries don't feel the need to have enrichment facilities, in that they will be able to always get supply of nuclear material from somewhere around the world, with a backstop with the agency, actually. And that's one of the things that's interesting that comes from the original Eisenhower idea. So it is rather complex. I agree. I simplified it somewhat here. If you want to look into detail, I'd have a look at the Nuclear Suppliers Group website. That's an interesting one for you to look at. Yes.
I'm curious to know, like, the dynamics of how the agency works with states in terms of, like, you mentioned the UAE example.
Yeah.
Like, if a state decides to start a nuclear program, how does the involvement of the agency works? Like, is it up to the agency to decide what they'll be involved with, as in terms of like giving advice and stuff? What if the state decides to do stuff by its own? Like, how does this kind of dynamic works?
Okay. Yeah. Good question. The agency doesn't tell people what to do in that sense. It provides advice on request from the member state. So what will happen is, let's say the UAE, it'll go, right, well, we want to, so they will say, agency, how can you help us out on this? Could you come in, have a look at our systems, and advise us accordingly on what we need to do? But remember, nuclear safety is a national responsibility. Nothing's legally binding in this area, for example, and certainly development of nuclear energy, there's nothing legally binding on that at all. Apart from the safeguards, they have to make sure that they've got a safeguards agreement, and the UAE made sure it signed the additional protocol, for example, to make sure that it was seen to be squeaky clean when it had a nuclear power program. So that's how it works. It's an advisory service, but I think they probably in some of the other areas see the advice as compelling or whatever, because it's based upon decent ideas that are set out in what is good practice around the world.
So just in connection to last question, So is it mandatory for a member state to disclose its new nuclear program to agency, or
Yeah.
they can do whatever they want?
Yes, it is mandatory, but under safeguards. So there are things that's called Modified Code 3.1, 5.1, sorry, which is part of the safeguards agreements, which is when a country goes beyond a certain level in terms of their development of a nuclear program, they have to declare it to the agency, who will then inspect accordingly. And there's various lines in the sand, so to speak, as to what is within and what is outside. So certain countries that will be looking to have a nuclear program, they'll say, yes, yes, we meet the conditions under modified code, and therefore that will happen. Now, that's been an issue with Iran, because Iran is arguing that that modified code is not legally binding, even though many other countries believe it is. And so that's one of the issues that there are currently there, as to whether Iran would feel it was, whether it needs to call in the inspectors. The inspectors are in Iran now. The JCPOA is in a difficult state, but it's still a comprehensive safeguards agreement. So there are inspectors in Iran from the agency all the time. But there may be some things that are being developed have reached a certain level which they feel they don't need to declare. So it's a tricky point sometimes, but most of the time it is the case that you say.
And there's one online. So it says, I'll read it out in case you can't see it. It says, would it be possible to discuss further implications of the AUKUS agreement to safeguards in the next presentation? Which I think answers your question from earlier.
Yes.
About what do you want to hear about next time?
I will do that as far as I think I can. But yes, I will talk about the general issue as to the dispute that there is there about the signatories of the AUKUS agreement, Australia, the UK and the US, definitely argued that it's entirely consistent with their obligations under the safeguards agreements. Some countries, China in particular, argues that it's not. So there are some real nuances as to what the agreement actually means. But I'd be willing to talk about that in a little bit more detail, yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think we've reached our time. So thank you, Mark, again for coming to present to us. And if anybody thinks of any questions, we're lucky enough to have Mark in the next instalment of the Dalton Expert Insight series.